The evening air was cool against Judge Thomas Reynolds's face as he rolled down the window of his new car. The midnight blue sedan had been a gift to himself after 15 years on the bench, a quiet celebration of a career built on hard work and dedication. The leather seats still had that new car smell, and the dashboard lights cast a soft glow as he drove through the tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge. Heading home after a long day in court, it had been a particularly draining afternoon, a difficult case involving a teenager caught with drugs, and Thomas had agonized over the sentence. The boy reminded him of so many young men he'd seen come through his courtroom, too many of them looking like him, too many of their futures hanging in the balance of his decisions. Sometimes the weight of that responsibility kept him awake at night. The clock on the dashboard read 7:43 p.m. His wife had texted earlier saying she was making his favorite pot roast for dinner. The thought made him smile. After 22 years of marriage, Lisa still knew exactly how to lift his spirits after a tough day. He turned onto Maple Avenue, a quiet residential street that would take him home faster than the main road. The houses here were well kept with neatly trimmed lawns and expensive cars and driveways. Thomas had taken this shortcut dozens of times before, though he didn't live in this particular neighborhood. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror startled him. Thomas checked his speed. He was going just under the limit. He hadn't run any stop signs or made any illegal turns. For a brief moment, he wondered if the police car was trying to pass him to get somewhere else. But when the siren gave a short wail, he knew he was being pulled over. With the practiced movements of someone who had been in this situation before, Thomas put on his turn signal and pulled carefully to the curb. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then he put both hands on the steering wheel, where they would be visible, and waited. Officer Paul Miller had been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for 7 years. He'd transferred from a busier precinct in the city, preferring the quieter pace of suburban policing. His dashboard computer showed that the luxury sedan he'd just pulled over had been purchased 3 weeks ago. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. An expensive car like that in this neighborhood, driven by someone who didn't seem to fit the profile of the area's residents. Miller approached the driver's side window cautiously, flashlight in one hand, the other resting near his holster. Standard procedure for any traffic stop, especially after dark. License and registration, Miller said, shining the light directly into Thomas's face, then sweeping it across the interior of the car. Thomas squinted against the bright light. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Miller didn't answer immediately. "License and registration," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now," Thomas said clearly, moving his right hand slowly toward his jacket pocket. He'd learned long ago that announcing his movements during traffic stops was a necessary precaution. "Just bought this car, huh?" Miller asked, watching Thomas's every move. "Yes, about 3 weeks ago." Thomas handed over his license and reached toward the glove compartment. "I'm getting the registration now." Miller's flashlight followed his hand. When Thomas opened the glove compartment, Miller tensed visibly. "Slowly," he ordered. Thomas nodded and carefully extracted the registration and insurance information, handing them to the officer. As Miller examined the documents, Thomas noticed another police car pulling up behind them. His heart sank a little. Whatever this was about, it was escalating. "This is a mighty expensive car for someone just passing through this neighborhood," Miller said, looking from the registration back to Thomas. "I'm taking a shortcut home," Thomas explained calmly. "I've driven this route many times." Miller handed back the license but kept the registration. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Thomas felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. "Officer, may I ask why?" "I haven't violated any traffic laws." "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle now." Miller's hand moved closer to his holster. Thomas knew better than to argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he stood up, he realized how much taller he was than the officer, another reason to be careful. A second officer approached from the other police car. Officer Rebecca Chen had been Miller's partner for the last 2 years. She was younger but often more level-headed in tense situations. "What's going on, Paul?" she asked, looking between her partner and Thomas. "Just checking some things out," Miller replied vaguely. "The registration for this vehicle was just issued. I want to make sure everything's in order." Thomas stood silently by his car, the evening growing chillier. Or perhaps it was just the situation making him feel cold. A few residents had come to their windows or porches watching the scene unfold. Thomas felt their eyes on him, the unfamiliar black man being questioned by police in their neighborhood. "Sir, how did you acquire this vehicle?" Miller asked, his tone suggesting he already had his suspicions. The implication wasn't lost on Thomas. "I purchased it from Riverside Luxury Motors 3 weeks ago," he said evenly. "The registration that you're holding confirms that. These types of vehicles are targets for theft," Miller continued. "And we've had reports of car thefts in neighboring areas." "I understand you're doing your job, officer," Thomas said, "but I've provided my identification and registration showing that I am the legal owner of this vehicle." Miller walked around the car, shining his flashlight through the windows, examining the interior. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Reynolds?" Thomas hesitated for just a moment. In his experience, revealing his profession sometimes changed the dynamic of these encounters, but not always for the better. Some officers became more respectful. Others became defensive or skeptical. "I'm a judge with the county court," he answered finally. Miller's flashlight paused in its sweep. He looked at Thomas with new interest, then back down at the license. "A judge?" he repeated, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Yes. Criminal Court 6th District." Thomas kept his voice neutral, factual. Chen, who had been standing slightly back, stepped forward. "Judge Reynolds? Did you preside over the Wilson case last month?" Thomas nodded, recognizing the shift that was about to happen. "Yes, I did." Chen turned to her partner. "Paul, Judge Reynolds handled that big drug trafficking case. It was all over the news." Miller's demeanor didn't change immediately. He handed the registration back to Thomas but didn't apologize or explain the stop. "We've had reports of vehicles matching this description being stolen," he said, his explanation sounding hollow even to his own ears. A car door opened across the street, and an older white man in a bathrobe stepped out onto his front lawn. "Everything okay over there, officers?" he called out. "Just a routine traffic stop, sir," Chen called back. "Please go back inside," but the neighbor didn't move. Instead, he pulled out his phone and appeared to be recording. 2 more residents had come outside, watching silently. Thomas felt a familiar mixture of emotions: frustration, humiliation, resignation. Even as a judge, even in an expensive suit, even in a car he had legitimately purchased after years of hard work, he was still just a suspicious figure to some. "Am I free to go now, officer?" Thomas asked quietly. Miller hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Yes, sir. Drive safely." As Thomas got back into his car, he could hear Chen speaking quietly but intensely to her partner. He didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. He'd been here before. The apology from one officer for another's behavior. The awkward backtracking. The sudden realization of who he was. He started the engine, aware that his hands were trembling slightly. The pot roast would be cold by now. Lisa would be worried. He'd have to explain why he was late, and he'd see that look in her eyes. Concern mixed with a deep, weary understanding. As he pulled away from the curb, Thomas glanced in his rearview mirror. The officers were still standing there, Miller looking tense as Chen continued talking to him. The neighbors had their phones out, perhaps posting about the incident already. Thomas took a deep breath and focused on the road ahead. In his courtroom tomorrow, he would be Judge Reynolds again, respected and addressed with deference. But tonight, on this quiet suburban street, he had been reminded once more of the other identity he could never shed, the one that made some people see a threat where there was none, a criminal where there was a judge. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Everything okay? Dinner's waiting." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He would tell her what happened when he got home. They would talk about it, process it together as they had so many similar incidents before. But for now, he just wanted to focus on driving safely, on getting home to his wife and that pot roast, on putting this evening behind him. But even as he drove away, Thomas knew this wasn't really over. It never really was. Thomas arrived home 20 minutes later than usual, the pot roast now sitting under foil on the dining room table. Lisa looked up from her book as he walked through the door, immediately noticing the tightness around his eyes. "It happened again, didn't it?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, hanging his coat in the hallway closet. He didn't need to explain further. After more than 2 decades together, Lisa could read the signs. The sly droop of his shoulders, the careful way he controlled his movements, the forced calm in his voice. "Oak Ridge?" she asked, marking her place in her book. "Maple Avenue." Thomas loosened his tie. 2 officers this time. Lisa stood up and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. They stood like that for a moment, neither speaking. Thomas felt some of the tension leave his body as he held his wife close. "Come eat something," she said finally. "You can tell me about it while we have dinner." As they sat at the table, Thomas recounted the stop. The suspicious questions, the flashlight in his face, the neighbors watching from their porches. Lisa listened without interrupting, though her expression darkened as the story unfolded. "Did you get their names? Their badge numbers?" she asked when he finished. Thomas shook his head. "Not this time. The younger officer, Chen, I think, she recognized me from the Wilson case. That changed things." "It shouldn't have to," Lisa said, her voice tight with anger. "Your title shouldn't be what makes them treat you with basic respect." Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know, but that's how it works sometimes. Are you going to report it?" Thomas took a bite of pot roast, considering the question. "I don't know yet. Let me sleep on it." Later that night, as Lisa slept beside him, Thomas stared at the ceiling, replaying the incident in his mind. He thought about the countless men who looked like him who passed through his courtroom, many arrested during traffic stops just like the one he'd experienced. How many of those stops had been based on nothing more than suspicion about who belonged where? Morning came too quickly. Thomas moved through his usual routine: shower, shave, breakfast, the news playing quietly in the background. He was buttering his toast when a familiar intersection appeared on the screen behind the local news anchor. "Incident on Maple Avenue last night has sparked controversy after bystander video was posted to social media, showing what appears to be Oak Ridge police officers questioning a man beside a luxury vehicle." Thomas froze, the knife still in his hand. The footage was grainy, shot from across the street, but he recognized himself standing beside his car with the 2 officers. The video didn't capture the conversation, just the image of him being questioned with his hands visible. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her work clothes already on, watching the screen with wide eyes. "That didn't take long," she said. Thomas put down the knife. No, it didn't. His phone rang. It was William Taylor, the chief judge of the county court system. "Thomas, I just saw the news. That was you on Maple Avenue last night?" "Yes, it was," Thomas confirmed, his voice deliberately casual. "Christ. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, William. Nothing I haven't dealt with before." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The mayor called me this morning. The police chief, too. They want to meet with you." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Of course they do." "You don't have to," William said quickly. "But I think it might be worth hearing what they have to say. Let me think about it. I'll let you know by noon." As Thomas drove to the courthouse, his phone buzzed continuously with text messages and calls from colleagues, friends, and eventually, reporters. By the time he reached his chambers, the court's public information officer was waiting for him. Judge Reynolds. "We've received 16 media requests for comments already this morning," said Gloria, her tablet in hand. "The video has over 50,000 views." Thomas set his briefcase down on his desk. "No comments right now, Gloria. I need to think about how I want to handle this." She nodded. "Of course. But just so you know, Officer Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The police department issued a statement an hour ago." Thomas looked up sharply. "Already?" "That was fast. The mayor's office is involved," Gloria explained. "They're calling it a high-priority internal review." After she left, Thomas sat at his desk, staring at the stack of case files waiting for his attention. His phone buzzed again. A text from Lisa with a link to the police department's statement. He clicked it and read quickly. The statement was carefully worded, expressing deep concern about the incident and promising a thorough investigation. It mentioned that one officer had been placed on administrative leave but didn't name Miller specifically. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Judge Diane Powell, his colleague from the next courtroom over. "I saw the news," she said, closing the door behind her. "You okay?" Thomas gave her a thin smile. "I'm fine. Just dealing with the fallout." Diane sat in the chair across from his desk. "You know, 5 years ago this would have been swept under the rug. The fact that they're actually doing something about it, Let's not celebrate too quickly, Thomas cautioned. Administrative leave with pay isn't exactly accountability. True, Diane conceded. But the spotlight is on them now. The whole city is watching. Thomas leaned back in his chair. That's what worries me. This isn't just about me anymore. It's becoming a symbol, and I'm not sure I want to be that symbol. You might not have a choice, Diane said gently. Not now that the video is out there. By lunchtime, Thomas had decided to meet with the mayor and police chief. His afternoon docket was light, and William had offered to cover it if needed. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at City Hall. As he drove downtown, Thomas spotted a small group of protesters outside the police department headquarters. Their signs read "Justice for All" and "Hold Police Accountable." Thomas felt a complicated mix of emotions, gratitude for the support, but also discomfort at becoming the center of this particular storm. The mayor's office was on the top floor of City Hall, with large windows overlooking the city. Mayor Patricia Garcia greeted him with a firm handshake when he arrived, as did Police Chief Robert Anderson. Thomas had encountered both of them at various civic functions over the years, but had never worked closely with either. Judge Reynolds, thank you for agreeing to meet with us, the mayor began once they were seated in her office. First and foremost, I want to extend my personal apology for what happened last night. Chief Anderson nodded gravely. The behavior displayed in that video does not reflect the standards we expect from our officers. I want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. Thomas studied both of their faces. Their concern seemed genuine, but he'd been in politics long enough to recognize damage control when he saw it. I appreciate that, he said carefully, but I'm curious about what happens next. The chief shifted in his seat. Officer Miller has been placed on administrative leave while we conduct our investigation. Officer Chen is being interviewed about the incident today, and after the investigation, Thomas pressed. That depends on the findings, the chief replied, but I can tell you that we have a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. Thomas resisted the urge to point out how rarely that zero-tolerance policy seemed to result in any meaningful consequences. Instead, he asked, what about department-wide training? Community oversight? Body cameras? The mayor and chief exchanged glances. Actually, the mayor said, leaning forward, we've been working on a police reform initiative for the past 6 months. This incident, well, it highlights exactly why those reforms are needed. Thomas raised an eyebrow. And you'd like me to be involved somehow? It wasn't a question, but the mayor nodded anyway. Your perspective as both a judge and someone who has personally experienced this kind of treatment would be invaluable. Thomas thought about Lisa's words from the night before. Your title shouldn't be what makes them treat you with basic respect. He thought about the men in his courtroom. Many without titles, without privilege, without cameras capturing their experiences. I'll consider it, he said finally. But first, I'd like to hear Officer Miller's side of the story. The chief looked surprised. You want to speak with him? Yes, Thomas said firmly. Not as a judge, not as part of your official investigation, but as the citizen he pulled over last night. I think we both deserve that conversation. As Thomas left City Hall, reporters called out questions from behind a security barrier. He didn't stop to answer them, but he did pause briefly to look at their cameras, making sure they captured his face. Not angry, not intimidated, just resolute. His phone rang as he reached his car. It was Lisa. How did it go? She asked. About as expected, Thomas replied, starting the engine. They're worried about the optics. They want me to help with their police reform initiative. And will you? Thomas pulled out of the parking space, thinking about everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I've asked to speak with Officer Miller first. Are you sure that's a good idea? Lisa sounded concerned. No, Thomas admitted, but it feels like the right next step. As he drove home, Thomas noticed people looking at his car more than usual. Word had spread. The midnight blue sedan that had been his private joy was now recognizable, a part of a story that was growing beyond his control. He wondered what Officer Miller was thinking right now, if he was watching the same news reports, reading the same social media posts. Tomorrow they would sit across from each other, not as officer and suspect, not as defendant and judge, but as two men trying to understand what had happened on Maple Avenue, and why. The meeting between Thomas and Officer Miller was set for the following afternoon. The police department had arranged for them. to use a small conference room in the community center, neutral ground for both men. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, parking his now recognizable sedan in the nearly empty lot. Inside, the room was bare except for an oval table and 6 chairs. A water pitcher and plastic cups had been set out, but no one else was there yet. Thomas chose a seat facing the door and waited, reviewing the questions he wanted to ask. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened. Officer Miller entered first, followed by Officer Chen. Thomas noticed immediately that Miller wasn't in uniform. He wore khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt that seemed too big for him. Chen was still in her police uniform, her posture straight and professional. "Judge Reynolds," Chen said with a nod. "Thank you for suggesting this meeting." Thomas stood and shook her hand, then extended his hand to Miller, who hesitated for just a second before taking it. "Officer Miller," Thomas acknowledged. "Thank you for coming." Miller nodded stiffly but didn't speak. The 3 of them sat down, an awkward silence filling the room. "I wasn't expecting both of you," Thomas said finally, looking at Chen. "I asked to be here," she explained. "I was part of what happened that night." Thomas nodded. "That's fine. I'm not here in any official capacity, just as a citizen trying to understand what happened." Miller shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the table. "I think it would help if you started," Thomas suggested, looking directly at Miller. "Walk me through what you were thinking when you saw my car on Maple Avenue." Miller cleared his throat. "I was doing my regular patrol. We'd had reports of car thefts in neighboring areas, high-end vehicles specifically. When I saw your car, it just stood out." "Because it was expensive?" Thomas asked. Miller hesitated. "Partly. And the other part?" Thomas pressed. Miller looked up finally, meeting Thomas's eyes. "Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend it wasn't about race. The department has me in all these sensitivity trainings now, talking about unconscious bias. But the truth is, I saw an expensive car in that neighborhood driven by a black man, and my first thought was that something wasn't right." The bluntness of the admission surprised Thomas. He'd expected denials, excuses, maybe even hostility. "Not this." "I appreciate your honesty," Thomas said after a moment. "It doesn't make it right," Chen interjected. "And it's not what we're taught." "But it happens," Thomas said quietly. Miller nodded. "Yeah, it happens. What would you have done differently?" Thomas asked. Looking back now, Miller took a drink of water, considering the question. "I still would have run the plates. That's just procedure. But the way I approached you, the assumptions I made, that's where I went wrong." "When did you realize who I was?" Thomas asked. "When Officer Chen recognized you," Miller admitted. "But I should have treated you with respect regardless of your position." Thomas leaned forward. "That's exactly the point. What about the people who don't have judge in front of their names? The ones who don't make the news when they're pulled over?" The room fell silent again. Chen looked uncomfortable, but Miller held Thomas's gaze. "I joined the force because I wanted to help people," Miller said finally. "My dad was a cop. His dad too. It's what we do. But lately," he trailed off, then started again. "The last few years it feels like we're at war sometimes. Us versus them. And I don't remember signing up for a war." Outside the window, Thomas could see a news van pulling into the parking lot. Word of their meeting had leaked somehow. "Looks like we have company," he said, nodding toward the window. Chen stood and peered outside. "Great, just what we need. Does it bother you?" Thomas asked Miller. "Being in the spotlight like this?" Miller gave a short, humorless laugh. "My kids can't go to school without hearing about how their dad is a racist cop. My wife gets dirty looks at the grocery store. Yeah, it bothers me." Thomas hadn't considered that side of things, how the incident had affected Miller's family. It didn't excuse what happened, but it added another layer to an already complex situation. "I have a proposition," Thomas said after a moment. "The mayor asked me to help with their police reform initiative. I'm thinking about agreeing, but only if it includes meaningful changes. Body cameras, community oversight, real consequences when lines are crossed." "And what does that have to do with me?" Miller asked cautiously. "I want you involved too," Thomas said. "Not as a token, not as the bad cop example, but as someone who's been honest about where the problems are." Miller looked stunned. "You want to work with me?" "I want to work toward a solution," Thomas clarified. "And I think you have a perspective that needs to be part of the conversation." Chen was watching them both with a calculating expression. The department won't like that. They're expecting you to file a complaint, maybe even a lawsuit. Is that what you want? Thomas asked her directly. She hesitated. I want things to get better. I became a cop because my brother was killed in a drive-by when I was 12. I thought I could make a difference from the inside. But some days, she shook her head. Some days it feels like I'm just part of the problem. Thomas could see the genuine pain in her eyes, the struggle to reconcile her ideals with reality. He looked back at Miller and saw something similar there. A man confronting his own failings in a system that often reinforced them. So what do you say? Thomas asked. Are you willing to be part of something more constructive than just an internal investigation? Before Miller could answer, there was a knock at the door. A nervous-looking aide from the mayor's office poked her head in. Judge Reynolds? The mayor is on her way. There's a situation developing outside. Thomas stood and walked to the window. The news van had been joined by two more, and a small crowd was gathering in the parking lot. Some held signs similar to the ones he'd seen outside the police department the day before. This is getting out of hand, he murmured. Welcome to my life for the past 2 days, Miller said, coming to stand beside him. Thomas turned to face him. We need to get ahead of this. All three of us together. Chen looked alarmed. You want to talk to the press? The chief specifically instructed us not to make any statements. I'm not suggesting a statement, Thomas explained. I'm suggesting a conversation. Public, transparent, honest. No prepared remarks, no damage control. Just 3 people talking about what happened and what needs to change. Miller looked skeptical. That could go very wrong, very fast. Or it could be the first step towards something better, Thomas countered. The door opened again, and Mayor Garcia entered, looking harried. Judge Reynolds, I'm so sorry about this. Someone leaked information about your meeting. It's all right, Thomas assured her. In fact, I think we might be able to use this situation constructively. He quickly outlined his idea. The mayor listened with growing surprise. That's unconventional, she said when he finished. The city's legal department would advise strongly against it. I'm sure they would, Thomas agreed. But sometimes the legally cautious approach isn't the right one. The mayor looked at Miller and Chen. And you two are willing to do this? Speak publicly off script? Chen glanced at Miller, who nodded slowly. Yes, she said. We are. 20 minutes later, Thomas stood before a cluster of microphones that had been hastily set up near the community center's entrance. Miller and Chen flanked him, with the mayor standing slightly apart. The crowd had grown to about 50 people, a mix of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. Thank you all for coming, Thomas began. I know this isn't the usual way these situations are handled, but then again, maybe that's part of the problem. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd as they realized this wasn't going to be a typical press conference. 2 nights ago, I was driving home when Officer Miller pulled me over. Thomas continued. What followed was an interaction that's unfortunately familiar to many black men. Regardless of their profession or position, he gestured to Miller, who stepped forward nervously. I made assumptions that night, Miller said, his voice slightly unsteady. Assumptions based partly on training, partly on experience, and partly, if I'm being honest, on bias. I was wrong. A reporter called out, Are you admitting to racial profiling, Officer Miller? Miller looked at Thomas, then back at the crowd. I'm admitting that I saw a black man in an expensive car in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I jumped to conclusions I shouldn't have. If that's racial profiling, then yes, that's what I did. The crowd murmured in surprise at his candor. Chen stepped forward next. As police officers, we're trained to look for things that don't fit patterns. But sometimes those patterns themselves are the problem. They can blind us to our own biases. Thomas watched the faces in the crowd, seeing confusion give way to interest. This wasn't the confrontation they had expected. It wasn't neat or simple or easily packaged into sound bites of outrage. What we're trying to do here, Thomas explained, is start a different kind of conversation. Not about blame or punishment, but about recognition and change. A young woman near the front called out, But there has to be accountability. Absolutely, Thomas agreed. Accountability is essential, but so is understanding. So is growth. For the next 30 minutes, the 3 of them fielded questions from the crowd. They didn't always agree. There were tense moments and uncomfortable silences. But there was also something that felt like progress. A genuine exchange rather than prepared statements and defensive posturing. As the impromptu forum wound down, a reporter asked one final question. "Judge Reynolds, do you forgive Officer Miller for what happened?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "Forgiveness isn't really what this is about," he said finally. "This is about recognition, seeing each other as human beings first before all the other labels we carry. Officer Miller recognized something important about himself today. I recognize the courage that took. And I hope everyone here recognizes that change doesn't happen through punishment alone." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Miller. "I never expected this," the officer said quietly. "When they told me you wanted to meet, I thought you were going to tear me apart." Thomas shook his head. "That wouldn't have solved anything." Miller nodded, then asked hesitantly, "So what happens now?" Thomas looked past him to where the mayor was speaking with reporters, already spinning the event as part of her reform initiative. "Now," Thomas said, "the real work begins." The days following the impromptu press conference were a whirlwind. Video clips of Thomas, Miller, and Chen speaking candidly about the traffic stop went viral, appearing on national news and sparking conversations across social media. Some praised their honesty and willingness to engage in public dialogue. Others criticized them from both sides, some saying Thomas was too lenient. Others claiming Miller had thrown his fellow officers under the bus. Thomas arrived at the courthouse the next morning to find a small group of supporters, waiting with coffee and handmade signs. Their gesture touched him, but it also made him uncomfortable. He hadn't set out to become a symbol or start a movement. He'd simply been driving home. In his chambers, he found a stack of messages and emails that had come in overnight. Interview requests from major networks, speaking invitations from universities and law schools, even a few book deal inquiries. Thomas set them all aside and focused on the cases scheduled for that day. Just before lunch, his clerk knocked on his door. "Judge Reynolds? There's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite insistent." Thomas looked up from his files. "Who is it?" "A Mr. Jackson. He says it's personal." Thomas frowned. The name wasn't familiar. "Give me 5 minutes to finish reviewing this motion, then send him in." When the door opened again, a tall, middle-aged black man entered. He was dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt, and he carried a worn leather messenger bag. "Judge Reynolds," the man said, extending his hand. "Anthony Jackson. Thank you for seeing me." Thomas shook his hand. "What can I do for you, Mr. Jackson?" "I saw you on the news yesterday," Jackson said, sitting in the chair across from Thomas's desk. "What you did with those officers, it got me thinking." "About what?" Jackson reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "About my son, Kevin Jackson. He was pulled over 3 years ago, just like you. Except his story didn't end with a press conference." Thomas felt a chill run through him. He'd presided over hundreds of cases that started with traffic stops. But something in Jackson's voice told him this was different. "What happened to your son?" he asked quietly. He was coming home from basketball practice, driving his girlfriend's car because she wasn't feeling well. Someone called the police about a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. Jackson's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. The officer who responded said Kevin reached for something, said he feared for his life. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. He knew how this story ended. "They found a basketball and a water bottle on the passenger seat," Jackson continued. "That's what he was reaching for. He was 17. "I'm so sorry," Thomas said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. Jackson nodded. The officer was cleared. Internal investigation found no wrongdoing. No charges filed. He looked up at Thomas. 3 years and not a single thing has changed in that department. Thomas understood now why Jackson had come. "You want me to help with your son's case?" "I want what you and that officer are doing to mean something," Jackson corrected him. "I've been fighting for 3 years, talking to anyone who would listen. But nothing changes. Then I see you on TV, standing next to a cop who admits he profiled you, talking about recognition and change." He leaned forward. "I need to know if that's real or just talk." The question hit Thomas hard. Was it just talk? The mayor's reform initiative, the planned community forums, the promises of new training and oversight, would any of it actually prevent another Kevin Jackson? "Mr. Jackson, I can't make promises about your son's case specifically," Thomas said carefully. "But I believe what we're trying to do is real. It has to be." Jackson studied him for a long moment. "Then I want to be part of it. not just as another grieving parent telling his story, but at the table where decisions are made. Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang. It was Lisa. "Thomas, have you seen the news?" she asked without preamble. "I've been in court all morning. What's happened?" "The police union just issued a statement condemning Officer Miller. They're calling for his resignation." Thomas felt his stomach sink. "Let me call you back," he said, then turned to Jackson. "I need to deal with something urgent. Can we continue this conversation later today?" Jackson nodded and stood. "I'll leave you my contact information." "But Judge Reynolds? Don't forget what I said. This has to be real." After Jackson left, Thomas called Chen immediately. "I just heard about the union statement," he said when she answered. "How's Miller doing?" "Not great," Chen replied. "He's at home. Some officers have been less than supportive." "I need to talk to him," Thomas said. "Can you arrange that?" "I'll try, but he's not taking many calls right now." 2 hours later, Thomas pulled up outside Miller's house in a modest suburb across town. It was a small ranch-style home with a well-kept yard and a basketball hoop in the driveway. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the garage. Miller answered the door in a t-shirt and jeans, looking tired and tense. His surprise at seeing Thomas was evident. "Judge Reynolds, I didn't expect to see you here." "Paul," Thomas said, using Miller's first name for the first time. "May I come in?" Miller hesitated, then stepped aside. The living room was neat but lived in, with family photos on the walls and a half-completed puzzle on the coffee table. "My kids and wife are at my in-laws," Miller explained, seeing Thomas glance at the puzzle. "We thought it would be better with all the attention." "I heard about the union statement," Thomas said. "I'm sorry." Miller shrugged, but Thomas could see the hurt beneath the casual gesture. "They're doing what they think is right." "Protecting the badge, from what? Honesty?" "From liability," Miller corrected. "Every word I said at that press conference could be used in lawsuits against the department, against other officers. They see me as a traitor." Thomas thought about Anthony Jackson and his son, about all the cases that never made the news because there wasn't a judge involved. "A man came to see me today," Thomas said. "His son was killed during a traffic stop 3 years ago. 17 years old. Miller's expression darkened. "Kevin Jackson. I remember the case. I didn't know him, but it hit the department hard. Did it change anything?" Miller looked away. "For a while. New training videos. A few community meetings. Then everything went back to normal." "That can't happen this time," Thomas said firmly. "What do you want from me, Judge?" Miller asked, a hint of frustration in his voice. "I'm already losing my career over this." "I want you to keep speaking the truth," Thomas replied. "Even when it's hard. Even when it costs you." Miller gave a bitter laugh. "Easy for you to say. You're a judge. You have status protection. I'm just a cop who crossed the thin blue line." The words stung, but Thomas recognized the truth in them. His position had protected him that night on Maple Avenue. It was protecting him now. "You're right," he acknowledged. "It's not the same for us. But that's exactly why your voice matters. You can say things I can't. Reach people I can't." Miller sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. "My father was a cop for 30 years. My brother, too. This job is all I know." "I'm not asking you to give up being a police officer," Thomas said, sitting across from him. "I'm asking you to help redefine what that means." They talked for nearly an hour, the initial tension gradually giving way to a cautious understanding. Miller spoke about the pressures of the job, the unwritten rules, the culture that valued loyalty above all else. Thomas shared stories from his courtroom, the patterns he'd seen over decades, the lives altered by split-second decisions. As Thomas prepared to leave, Miller asked the question that had clearly been on his mind from the start. "Why are you doing this? You could have filed a complaint, sued the department, made a big statement, and moved on. Why get involved like this?" Thomas thought about the question carefully. "Because I'm tired of seeing the same story play out over and over. Because meeting you made me realize that there are good people on both sides of this who feel trapped in a broken system. And because," he paused, thinking of Anthony Jackson, "because next time it might not be a judge in that car. It might be someone without a voice, without power, without the cameras showing up afterward." Miller nodded slowly. "So what's our next move?" "The mayor's organizing the first reform committee meeting for next week. I want you there. And I want to bring someone else too, Anthony Jackson." Miller's eyes widened. "The father? You think that's a good idea?" "I think it's necessary," Thomas said. This can't just be about what happened to me. It has to be about Kevin Jackson too and all the others who didn't make the news. As Thomas drove home, his phone rang again. It was the Chief Judge, William. Thomas, I've been trying to reach you all day. The Judicial Ethics Committee has concerns about your involvement in this police matter. Thomas sighed. He'd been expecting this. What kind of concerns? They're worried about the appearance of impartiality. You're taking a very public position on a politically charged issue. I'm advocating for fairness and accountability, William. Those aren't political positions, they're judicial values. I agree, William said, but not everyone sees it that way. There's talk of asking you to recuse yourself from cases involving police officers. The implications were clear. Thomas had spent his career building a reputation for fairness and impartiality. Now that reputation was being questioned. I need to think about this, he said finally. Take the weekend, William advised. But Thomas? Whatever you decide, I've got your back. The support meant more than Thomas could express. Thank you, William. That night, Thomas and Lisa sat on their back porch, watching the sunset and discussing everything that had happened. The cool evening air carried the scent of Lisa's garden as she listened to his dilemma. So now you have to choose, she said when he finished. Your role as a judge or your work on these reforms, Thomas nodded. If I step back from the reform committee, I can keep things as they are. Keep hearing all types of cases, maintain the appearance of impartiality. But, Lisa prompted, knowing there was more. But then I'm just another person who saw a problem, made some noise, and moved on, Thomas finished. Nothing really changes. Lisa took his hand, her expression thoughtful. You know, when you told me about being pulled over that night, I was angry. I wanted you to file a complaint, make them pay somehow. But what you're doing now, she squeezed his hand. This could actually make a difference. It could also end my career as I know it, Thomas pointed out. Lisa smiled slightly. The Thomas Reynolds I married has never been afraid to do what's right, even when it's hard. As darkness fell around them, Thomas thought about the choice before him. About Anthony Jackson and his son. About Paul Miller and the puzzle on his coffee table. About all the intersections, literal and figurative, where lives could change in an instant. I need to make some calls, he said finally, standing up. Starting with Anthony Jackson. 3 months had passed since that night on Maple Avenue. Summer had given way to fall, leaves turning golden on the trees lining the streets of Oak Ridge. The community center parking lot was full as Thomas pulled in, recognizing many of the cars now. Anthony Jackson's old pickup truck, Paul Miller's blue sedan, Mayor Garcia's official vehicle. Inside, the large meeting room was set up with chairs in a circle, rather than the usual rows. It had been Thomas's idea. No head of the table, no hierarchy, just people facing each other as equals. It was a small thing, but it had set the tone for the weekly meetings of what the local paper had dubbed the Maple Avenue Coalition. Thomas greeted familiar faces as he made his way through the room. Chen was chatting with 2 community activists near the coffee station. Miller stood with Anthony Jackson by the windows, the 2 men deep in conversation. Their unlikely friendship had been one of the most surprising developments of the past months. Judge Reynolds, called a voice from behind him. It was Gloria, his court's public information officer, hurrying toward him with her ever-present tablet. The news crews are set up outside. They're asking if you'll make a statement before the town hall begins. Thomas shook his head. No statements today. This isn't about me. They're not just here for you, Gloria pointed out. It's the 3-month mark since the incident. And with the department's new policies being announced tonight, there's a lot of interest. All the more reason to stay focused on the work. Not the cameras, Thomas replied. The decision he'd made 3 months ago still felt right. He had stepped back from criminal cases involving police officers, limiting his docket to civil matters and criminal cases where law enforcement testimony wasn't central. Some of his colleagues had disagreed with the move, seeing it as an admission that he couldn't be impartial. Thomas saw it differently, as a recognition that his public advocacy work and his judicial role needed clear boundaries. Mayor Garcia approached, clipboard in hand. We're nearly ready to start. Full house tonight, Thomas nodded. Any word from the police union representatives? They'll be here, the mayor confirmed. Not happy, but here. That's all we can ask for right now, Thomas said. The town hall was the culmination of 3 months of difficult, often contentious meetings. The reform committee had begun with just a few members. Thomas, Miller, Chen, Anthony Jackson, and representatives from the mayor's office and police department. It had grown to include community activists, other officers, legal experts, and family members of those affected by police encounters. They'd reviewed policies and training procedures, examined data on traffic stops and use of force incidents, and listened to countless personal stories. The proposals they'd developed weren't revolutionary, but they were substantive: body cameras for all officers, a civilian review board with real authority, revised protocols for traffic stops, and mandatory de-escalation training. At 7 o'clock, Thomas took his place in the circle as the room filled with nearly 200 people. He sat between Anthony Jackson and Lisa, who had become increasingly involved in the coalition's work. Mayor Garcia opened the meeting, explaining its purpose and introducing the key participants. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief. 3 months ago, I was pulled over a few blocks from here, he began. What could have been just another incident, just another complaint filed and forgotten, instead became the beginning of something important. Not because of who I am, but because of who we all decided to be in response. He gestured to Miller, who sat across the circle. Officer Miller chose honesty over defensiveness. He turned to Anthony Jackson. Mr. Jackson chose engagement over bitterness, despite having every reason to give up on the possibility of change. Finally, he looked at the audience, and this community chose conversation over conflict. The first hour of the meeting was dedicated to presenting the coalition's proposals. Different members took turns explaining each recommendation, the research behind it, and how it would be implemented. Thomas noticed the police union representatives in the back row, their expressions guarded but not dismissive. Then came the part Thomas had been both anticipating and dreading, opening the floor for public comments. A line quickly formed at the microphone set up in the aisle. The first speaker was an older white woman who lived on Maple Avenue. I was watching from my porch that night when Judge Reynolds was pulled over, she said. I've lived here 40 years and I'm ashamed to say I've seen it happen before to other black drivers. But I never said anything. I never did anything. She paused, her voice wavering slightly. I want to do better. These proposals are a start. Next was a young patrol officer still in uniform from his shift. I didn't want to come tonight, he admitted. A lot of us feel like Officer Miller threw us under the bus, like all cops are being painted as racists because of one traffic stop. He glanced at Miller, then back at the audience. But I've been reading these proposals, and they're not about punishing police. They're about making us better at our jobs, about rebuilding trust. I think that's something we need. Speaker after speaker approached the microphone. Not all were supportive. Some community activists felt the proposals didn't go far enough. Some residents worried about the cost of implementation. A few officers expressed concerns about additional scrutiny, making their already difficult jobs harder. Thomas listened to each perspective, noting how different the conversation was from the heated exchanges of their early meetings. People disagreed, sometimes strongly, but they were listening to each other. Toward the end of the comment period, a tall young man in his early 20s approached the microphone. Thomas didn't recognize him, but he saw Anthony Jackson sit up straighter beside him. My name is David Jackson, the young man said. Kevin was my brother. A hush fell over the room. This was the first time any of Kevin Jackson's siblings had spoken at a coalition event. When Kevin died, our family fell apart, David continued. My dad barely spoke for months. I was so angry I couldn't see straight. I wanted someone to pay. He looked directly at the police officers present. I hated all of you. Every uniform I saw reminded me of what happened to my brother. David paused, collecting himself. My dad kept telling me that nothing would bring Kevin back, that we had to find a way to make his death mean something. I didn't want to hear it, but then he started bringing home notes from these meetings, showing me what you all were working on. He held up a printed copy of the proposals. This isn't perfect. It won't fix everything, but it might have saved my brother, and it might save someone else's brother. He turned to face Miller and the other officers. I'm still angry. I still hurt. But I'm ready to talk. I'm ready to try. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as David returned to his seat. Anthony reached over and squeezed Thomas's arm. A silent thank you. The formal vote to adopt the proposals was almost anticlimactic after the emotional public comments. The city council members present voted unanimously to move the recommendations forward to the full council. with funding for immediate implementation of the body camera program. As the meeting broke up, Thomas found himself standing with Miller, Chen, and Anthony Jackson near the exit. "So," Miller said, "what happens now?" "Now the real work begins," Anthony replied, echoing the words Thomas had spoken 3 months earlier. "Policies on paper don't change anything unless they're lived every day," Chen nodded. "We've already started incorporating the new protocols into training at the academy. The cadets have a lot of questions, but they're engaged." "And the veteran officers?" Thomas asked. "Some are coming around," Miller admitted. "Others will take more time. Change is hard, especially when you've been doing things the same way for decades." "Speaking of change," Anthony said, turning to Thomas, "I heard a rumor that you're considering a different position." Thomas smiled slightly. The news hadn't been made public yet. "The governor called last week. There's an opening on the state Supreme Court. She thinks my experience with the coalition would bring a valuable perspective." "Would you take it?" Chen asked. Thomas looked around at the community center emptying out, at the people still gathered in small groups continuing their conversations. "A few months ago I would have said yes without hesitation. It's the kind of opportunity judges dream about. But now?" Miller prompted. "Now I think there's important work to be done right here," Thomas said. "The coalition is just getting started. These proposals are just the beginning. The bench needs people like you too, though," Anthony pointed out. "People who understand both sides of the system." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the truth in that. "I haven't decided yet. Lisa and I are still talking it through." As if summoned by her name, Lisa appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. "Ready to go home?" The four of them walked out together into the cool evening air. The news crews were packing up their equipment, most having already gotten the sound bites they needed from the mayor's post-meeting statement. In the parking lot, they paused to say their goodbyes. It struck Thomas how unlikely this small group was: a judge, 2 police officers, and a grieving father, standing together as colleagues, maybe even as friends. "Same time next week?" Anthony asked. Miller nodded. "I'll bring the data from the first body camera rollout. And I'll have the civilian review board candidates," Chen added. They turned to Thomas expectantly. "I'll be there," he promised. "Whatever I decide about the court position, I'm committed to seeing this through." As Thomas and Lisa drove home, the streets of Oak Ridge quiet around them, she asked the question that had been on his mind all evening. "Do you think it will last? The changes, the coalition, all of it?" Thomas considered this carefully. "I don't know. Systems are resistant to change. People fall back into old patterns. New incidents happen and tensions flare up again. That's not very optimistic," Lisa observed. "But," Thomas continued, "I've seen something in the past 3 months that I hadn't seen before. People from all sides willing to stay at the table, even when it's uncomfortable. That gives me hope." He thought about David Jackson's courage in speaking out, about Miller risking his career to acknowledge hard truths, about the officer in uniform admitting he needed to rebuild trust. "Change doesn't happen all at once," Thomas said. "It happens in moments of recognition, in choices to listen rather than defend, in the decision to keep showing up day after day, even when it would be easier to walk away." As they turned onto their street, Thomas's midnight blue sedan no longer felt like just a car. It had become quite accidentally a vehicle for something much larger than himself, a journey toward understanding that was just beginning. "So," Lisa said as they pulled into their driveway, "are you going to take the Supreme Court position?" Thomas smiled at his wife, the person who had stood beside him through every step of this unexpected journey. "I think," he said, "I'm right where I need to be."